Now that you've learned the absolute basics, let's review some workflow. I'm going to create a new Laravel application, my app, and give that a second. And then I will cd into that. And I will go ahead and initialize Git. And let's review the Git status. Sure enough, we see all of the files there from the Laravel framework. Okay, I'm in my project root, so I can add everything here. And I will commit with a message that describes what I've done. In this case, I installed Laravel. Now, on that note, if I scroll up, notice that for the message itself, I always use the present tense. So in this case, I didn't say installed Laravel, even though that would be fine. Nothing's going to happen. It's just a message. But that being said, you'll find it's a general common practice to write your commit messages in the present tense. And that makes it actually a little bit more readable. For example, when you are reviewing the log, especially when you have lots of commits, you can see right here, okay, this commit installs Laravel. This next commit does something else. Easy to understand. All right, so now if I were to edit this, and we're not building anything here, we're just demonstrating the basic workflow. Now here's one of the biggest confusions I had when I was learning Git. As it was explained to me, and as I learned from reading books, the basic idea is if you can describe the change that you just made, then you probably should commit it. Now, here's the thing. This is a good recommendation, and then at the same time, it's incredibly vague. For example, if I go to routes.php, maybe we add a new route for an about page and do something like this. What does that mean? Because I added a new route for the about page, that I should then go and commit it? No, in most situations, that's absolutely not the case. But that still begs the question, well, when do I create a new commit? And maybe you can think of it like this. When you hit a milestone, it's time to commit. And this is especially useful if you build your application in terms of features. You do it in little steps, like I want an authentication layer for my application. So you code all of that, you make it work. Once it's tested, everything works great. That's a good stopping point. Think of it like that. I hit this milestone, that feature is implemented, let's go ahead and commit it. Let's imagine that we've done it. So we would add all the files to the staging area. We would commit it with add authentication layer, and we're done. Okay, next, maybe you decide, well, I need some kind of reporting layer for my application. So let's imagine you're building just a typical blog and you want to report on that. You probably don't need to, but if you wanted that, maybe you could compile the total number of posts. You could check the frequency for how often you post and then put that on a line graph or something. I don't know, but let's imagine that's the next step. Okay, well that could represent a milestone or feature, and when it's implemented, you can commit it. So we can do whatever logic to add reporting to our app. And when that's done, add everything to the staging area. And remember, always as a good practice, check your status first. You want to make sure that everything relevant to adding a reporting layer is represented here. Because sometimes if you're not careful, and if you're just working all over the place, well, if you do git add period, that's going to add all of the files, every file if you're in your project root. But for example, if you just change some kind of config item that is completely unrelated, well, you want to make sure that's not included with the same commit. I hope that makes sense. Okay, but anyways, once you've added your files, you commit and say add reporting. Now though, that does beg the question, well, what about situations where you want your message to be longer? Maybe, for example, you're fixing a bug, or whatever the commit is just needs a little bit more information. Okay, in those cases, here's what you can do. I will git commit, and because I don't add -m, it'll open up an editor to write the message. And now here's what you can do. The first line will be the general description, like add reporting layer. Now, if you need more information, just separate it by a line, and you can add it here. In this case, I'll paste in some lorem text. So now, if I exit out with Command Q, and if I run a git log, yes, it'll show up, but when you push it up to maybe a service like GitHub, it'll correctly just parse out that first line and paste it next to the commit message. And that way, it's a lot more useful and readable for you, as well as anyone browsing your repo. Now, one last thing. What about those situations where you're starting a new project and you really are just sort of all over the place? You're not necessarily working on one specific feature, you're just kind of getting tons of stuff prepped. You're adding routes, you're doing this, you're doing that, you're changing config, you're adding settings, all of that stuff. How do you break that down? Because in that case, you're just sort of working on the project. And you know what? That's perfectly fine. You'll often see commit messages where the developer just writes, for example, working on such and such. And that's completely fine, to be honest. Especially in the early days of a project, when you haven't even pushed this up for the rest of the world, it doesn't matter that much. In fact, what a lot of people do is they don't even initialize Git until they have sort of their first draft. I do this a lot for smaller things, like if I'm working on a Composer package. I'll get it to work, and then I will git init. I will say git add everything, and then git commit with a message of first draft. And then from then on, for any new feature I add or any bug fix or things like that, each of those get their own commit. But as with anything, the reality is a lot of people do it differently. If you're working with a company, just figure out what their system is and follow it. All right, so now that you're comfortable with the absolute basics, why don't we move on to branching? Figure out what that is, why you would use it, and why it's helpful.